Hello. Today I'm going to be reviewing The Spectacular Spider-Man and trying to justify the bold claim that I made in the title. The Spectacular Spider-Man is an animated show featuring the titular character Spider-Man. It ran for 2 seasons, each with 13 episodes, before it was ultimately cut short. This gives us 26 total episodes, but there was definitely plenty of room for more episodes. But there's no point speculating as to what could have been, so let's just have a look at what we did get and why I think it was so good. This series follows the titular character Spider-Man. Overall, his portrayal is pretty good, with him being a do-good hero who always tries to save people, always does the right thing and never gives up, and he maintains his sense of justice and a good nature most of the time. Spidey embodies all of the heroic qualities that he's meant to, and he's pretty good in this series because of that. But Spider-Man is only one half of the character, because Spider-Man is the superhero persona of Peter Parker. And this show isn't just about what Peter does as Spider-Man, but it's also about what Peter does as Peter, and how these two aspects of his lives interact with each other and affect one another. We see throughout the show that his double life as a superhero has quite a big impact on his personal life as well, in some ways for better and in other ways for worse. Some examples of this include Peter getting in trouble because he misses his curfew since he's out late at night battling supervillains. And his relationship with his friends can get a bit strained at times because he keeps running off all the time. Of course, he can't tell them the truth of why he's running off because they don't know he's Spider-Man and he doesn't want anyone to know. He wants to keep it a secret. So the excuse he uses is that he's taking pictures for the Daily Bugle, which technically he is. But this often causes him to look somewhat selfish, and it damages some of his relationships as a result. More on that in a bit. But it's done really well, and it shows how having this secret life has an impact on his own personal life as well. There's consequences for his actions, and it lends quite a bit of believability to the series. If I had to pick out one little problem, we don't really see this affect his schooling very much. I think it would have been interesting if they explored a bit more what impact this could have had on his schooling, if he's like missing lots of classes and falling behind on schoolwork and all that, which isn't really something that they address in the series. Like, Peter's occasionally late to school, but there doesn't seem to be much consequences for that. But that's just a nitpick, really. It's a fairly minor issue. A really good example of the impact his life can have on him is in the 3rd episode, Natural Selection. This is the episode with the lizard, and basically after Connors gets transformed into the lizard and runs off to cause havoc, Peter ends up running away, giving some, lame excuse to his friends as to why he's going to leave, which is so that he can sneak off and put on his Spider-Man suit and, go fight the lizard or whatever. So he does that, but then the next day, the Daily Bugle prints a bunch of pictures of the fight between Spider-Man and the lizard, and obviously pictures taken by Peter Parker. From the perspective of his friends, Peter's run off and then gone and taken pictures of what's going on without offering to help at all, which leads to Peter getting fired as an intern. And he also pisses off Eddie Brock, damaging their friendship, which sets up the Venom arc later in the series. Oh, and that's another thing that this series does really well. It establishes characters and plot points and future events in advance, which is pretty good. For example, Eddie Brock appears really early, which allows the series to slowly build him up towards becoming Venom. And I could go on about a whole bunch of other examples of this, but I think that would be unnecessary. There are lots of side characters in this show that Peter interacts with throughout his daily life, most of them being his fellow school students. One of these is Gwen Stacy, who is Peter's friend, and she appears in most episodes, I believe. They have a pretty good friendship, but Gwen wants something more than friendship. So later she gets involved in a love triangle between Peter, Gwen, and Liz. And then she further complicates matters by starting to date Harry Osborn, even though it seems like she doesn't really want to be with him. So yeah, Gwen mostly gets involved in personal relationship drama, particularly in season 2, which is where the show gets a bit heavy with all the relationship drama and stuff. Liz Allen is another side character, and she's actually pretty interesting. She starts out in Flash Thompson's crowd, and initially she, like the rest of the people in that group, sort of looks down at Peter, doesn't really think much of him, but then her opinion starts to slowly change as they hang out a bit, and they eventually end up dating. And Peter and Liz actually go quite well with each other when Peter isn't running off to do Spider-Man things, that is. And that same sort of arc of going from looking down at Peter and not really respecting him or not really liking him to learning to like him and respect him more is something that a few other characters that are a part of that group go through as well. Even Flash Thompson himself. Yeah, Flash Thompson has an arc in this show. He goes from the stereotypical bully who pulls childish pranks and is just generally a dickhead to Peter because that's what he does, to actually being someone who comes to Peter for advice and actually tries to be a decent human being. So it's good to see Flash Thompson actually being an interesting character in this show, as opposed to the live action films where he's just not. Harry Osborn, he was alright, I suppose. I don't know, I never really cared much for this version of him. And he's kind of underused a bit. He starts out as Peter's friend, and they hang out a little bit, but then he sort of disappears from the show for several episodes. And then when he comes back, he serves as more of a rival to Peter in the whole love triangle relationship dynamic between everyone, since he starts dating Gwen or whatever. And aside from that, the show also likes to play up the mystery of who is the Green Goblin? Is it Harry or Norman? And I think Harry gets too wrapped up in that whole arc that he doesn't really get a chance to be a supporting character and a friend for Peter for very long, which kind of makes the whole rivalry have a bit less bite later on. I mean, I don't think it was bad, I just didn't care for him as much in this series. Aunt May is also an important character as Peter's guardian and parental figure. She's very kind, but also at a few times has to tell people off, including Peter. We find out pretty early that she's struggling to afford the bills now that Uncle Ben is gone. And this is actually the motivation behind Peter wanting to take photos of Spider-Man, because it's a way for him to earn money so he can help with the bills. I also want to mention J. Jonah Jameson, who looks like he's about to invade Poland. He's really good in this show, and the voice actor did a really good job of portraying him. They give him a few good moments, like they give him that whole saving Peter moment like he does in the first Sam Raimi film. But overall, he's mostly just there for comedy, as you'd expect. I don't really have much else to say about him, aside from he's good in this show. He's pretty good, pretty funny. So yeah, those are the main side characters I thought were worth talking about. There are a bunch of others, like Mary Jane, but I don't really think there's much point talking about any other ones at this stage. Season 1 starts out with Peter already being Spider-Man, which I think is great because it means we don't have to waste time with a drawn-out origin story. We can just jump straight into the action. So the series starts with Spidey stopping some regular crimes, but then we start to see the creation of supervillains. And Spider-Man has to fight these supervillains who prove to be a lot tougher than your regular crook and require Spidey to get a bit more creative to beat them. Throughout the start of the first season, most of the episodes introduced a new supervillain to contend with for that episode. So we get introduced to a whole bunch of supervillains like Vulture, Rhino, Sandman, a few others as well. And then there's Green Goblin, who stands out because he actually gets 2 episodes dedicated to himself, plus an episode in between where he is the one who actually sets up the villain for that episode, which is cool because it makes Gobby feel like a much bigger threat compared to the rest, which, to be fair, is true because Green Goblin is arguably Spider-Man's biggest villain in this show. The villains are pretty good. They all have their distinct abilities and powers and personalities, and they stand apart from one another. And they also generally have some really solid banter with Spidey. Actually, that's something that's really good in this show. The banter and quips are top-notch quality, especially between Spider-Man and Green Goblin. So as I mentioned in an earlier segment, throughout this season, Spider-Man has to sort of learn to balance his life between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And This is expanded really well towards the end of the season when we have the symbiote arc. So the symbiote ends up coming to Earth and bonding with Spider-Man, giving him the black suit, which makes him much stronger and enhances his powers quite a bit. During this time, most of the villains that he had beaten in the previous episodes end up escaping and forming a team called the Sinister Six. And their goal is basically just to kill Spider-Man. And it's only because of the black suit and the symbiote enhancing his powers that Spidey is able to actually beat the Sinister Six. I'll talk a bit more about that in a later segment. But although the suit gives him more power, it also affects his mental state quite a bit. It makes Peter angrier and more selfish. He ends up clashing with Eddie Brock and destroys their already quite strained friendship. And then there's a moment where Flash actually calls Peter out for being a dickhead, which is quite possibly one of the greatest moments in the entire show. Following this, Peter ends up trying to get rid of the symbiote, which results in him having to go through like a whole big internal struggle with the symbiote, but he eventually manages to get rid of it, only for it to then bond with Eddie Brock, which leads to Eddie Brock becoming the supervillain Venom, who ends up serving as the final boss of season 1, so to speak. Overall, I think season 1 was outstanding and demonstrated all the best aspects of the show. It was just solid from start to finish. But how about the next season? How does it hold up? Season 2 explores a lot of the same sort of topics, such as the whole double life that Peter leads and how that affects his personal life and his life as Spider-Man. However, this season also gives us a lot more relationship drama. As I mentioned earlier, Peter ends up in a big love triangle with Gwen and Liz, and then Gwen starts dating Harry. So then there's that rivalry between Peter and Harry. And overall, I didn't really care too much for all this relationship drama. Not to say that it's necessarily bad, but your interest in this plotline might depend on how interesting you find teen romance, high school drama, and personally, I don't find that very interesting. There's also an interesting thing that happens midway through this season where we have Venom returning and he actually outs Peter Parker as Spider-Man to the press, leading to everyone trying to figure out if this claim is true or not. This was actually a pretty good plot point. It was pretty funny seeing all these people saying, oh, Peter can't be Spider-Man, there's no way. But more importantly, it also makes Venom stand out a bit more as a bigger threat and gives him a nice final outing. Another major plot point in this season is the gang war. A whole bunch of people are trying to vie for control of the criminal underworld, including Tombstone, Silver Sable, and Doc Ock. And there's actually an episode where they all end up fighting each other and Spider-Man comes into the mix. So you have some villain on villain action. It's all pretty cool. But then in the end, it's the Green Goblin who swoops in and actually takes control of the criminal underworld in the end, setting him up as the final threat for season 2. And overall, this arc was pretty cool. Like, it's cool to see the different villains having their own motivations and goals, apart from just kill Spider-Man. I mean, I know a lot of the other villains had goals that weren't just kill Spider-Man, but a lot of the other villains just kind of gave up on their other goals. Speaking of villains, we get a few new ones introduced in this season, including Kraven, Mysterio, and Molten Man. But overall, I feel like these new villains were a bit lacking to me. They just weren't as interesting as some of the other villains that had already been introduced, and their banter just wasn't on the same level of quality as with other villains. We also have the return of the Sinister Six, albeit with some changes to the roster. But the Sinister Six's inclusion in season 2 really irks me. So in the first season, I think the Sinister Six were handled really well. That season started by introducing villain after villain, giving us a bunch of new threats with each episode. Towards the end of that season, we have a big breakout and a whole bunch of these people escape from prison and they all team up with the express goal of killing Spider-Man. Now, this team up makes sense given they were all beaten by Spider-Man, and it also sets up for a really tense and dangerous situation. Like, you know how Spider-Man barely beat those villains? Well, now 6 of them are there at once. Oh shit. Peter is forced to flee when he first encounters them because he can't fight them all at once. But then what happens is the symbiote ends up taking control of his body while he's sleeping and goes and fights the Sinister Six itself. This results in a very tense and serious fight without any of Spider-Man's usual quips and stuff because he's not talking, he's asleep, which makes this fight really stand out. And eventually the symbiote is able to defeat the Sinister Six through creative means and exploiting their own weaknesses and getting them to accidentally hit each other. It was overall a really good episode. However, because of the way things went down, technically Peter hasn't actually beaten the Sinister Six before, and he no longer has the black suit. So this leaves room to have the Sinister Six return and have it be a really tense and serious fight as well. Their return, them coming back to fight him 6 against 1, could have been a really big thing again. But what ends up happening is they just randomly show up in an episode right at the start of the series in season 2 with limited build-up, and then they attack 2 at a time for some reason. So basically 2 villains attack Spider-Man, and then once Spider-Man beats them, 2 more villains arrive and fight them. And it's stupid, like, it doesn't make sense. It's an idiotic plan. It defeats the purpose of having the Sinister Six, or should I call them the Dastardly Duos. Now you could argue maybe they don't want to all fight at once because they'll hit each other and take each other out. And I mean, maybe that was a problem that they ran into in their first encounter. But they could have also learnt from that and could be more careful in this fight. Plus, they've got a couple new team members, so the dynamic is a bit different. But anyway, that's a fairly minor issue in an otherwise great show. Overall, I think season 2 was pretty good. It was the same great show and the same great content as the first one. I don't think it had the same level of quality as season 1. A few of the episodes were a bit weaker and it just wasn't quite as cohesive as the first season. But it's still a great show and there's still lots of great stuff in these episodes. So yeah, season 2 is by no means bad. It's just a little weaker than the first season. I have a confession to make. I haven't actually watched any of the several other animated Spider-Man shows out there. Given that fact, it's a bit unfair for me to claim this is the best, but that doesn't really make for a great title, does it? I will say, however, that this show is spectacular. It has great characters, great writing, great humour, and great animation. I could go on, but I think I made my point by now. I highly recommend watching this show if you haven't already. Now, one quick little warning. I recently watched this show on Disney Plus, and for some reason, one of the season 2 episodes was placed out of order. Episode 5 of season 2, called First Steps, was actually listed at the end of the season for some reason, which is a bit bizarre. I'm not sure why it was like that or if it's been fixed or not, but just be aware of that. Because if you skip that episode, then you might be a bit confused as to why Harry's all of a sudden back and where the hell Venom's come from. But anyway, that's it for my review. I hope you found this video helpful and entertaining, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye.